Whether you're a cradle Catholic or a new convert, we all have questions about our faith traditions. From the history, to the prayers, to the culture it's inspired, there's so much to explore. To help us make sense of it all, I'll be talking to the experts at the Church of St. Paul the Apostle in New York City to get to the heart of how to live out our sacred and ancient faith in the modern world. No matter how long you've been journeying with Christ, we could all use a bit more practice. I'm Jack Schneider, and this is Practicing Catholic. Hi everybody, welcome back to Practicing Catholic. My name's Jack, and today I'll be sitting down with Father Chris Lawton, who is a newly minted Paulist Father, actually just as of last May, so he's going into his first Lent. Before becoming a priest, Father Chris was actually a medical doctor of internal medicine. Hopefully we'll get some very interesting insights today on fasting. So thank you for coming on, Father.
I'm so glad to be with you, Jack.
All right, so I guess we'll ask, the most basic question. What purpose does fasting serve during Lent?
So we think of fasting as one of our real pillars of our Lenten journey. We have basis for our practice of fasting going back to actually the most ancient scriptures, right? We think about the ancient Jewish people, the ancient Israelites journeying in the desert for an extended period of time. We still use that desert imagery in our fast. And Jesus, before he began his public ministry, was in the wilderness for a period of 40 days. So even the early Christians had a sense that this period of preparation, of recommitting our lives and our relationship with God was critical for us. So it really has its roots in that period. In terms of our own understanding of this season, the way in which we fast during Lent reminds us that we have a real dependence on God at all times. That fasting also reminds us of the sacrifice of Jesus, who gives up a great deal during his earthly life, but ultimately makes the greatest sacrifice of giving his life for us. And in our own time, fasting and removing what is unnecessary and even giving up some of our pleasures can help us have greater empathy, compassion for those who have less in our community.
So it extends, in a spiritual sense almost, but also in a more, personal, the way you are out in the world sense as well? Absolutely.
So we would say as Catholics that our fasting affects, most importantly, two relationships. I like to think of them as the vertical and the horizontal. So it's having an effect on my relationship with God. I'm reminded of just how dependent I am on God. This is one of the reasons that when Jesus speaks about those having less actually having more, or having a greater blessedness, we might say, because those who have less materially, or in other ways, we think about Lent, how are we poor in spirit? Jesus sometimes talks about that. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. We might hear that as, blessed are those who remember that ultimately we are dependent on God. We are dependent on the Spirit of God in every way. So it affects that relationship, but also our fasting and our awareness of the fact that some people in our world that is not equal in terms of people's resources, we have greater compassion for those who have less, and that affects maybe how we reach out, hopefully, to those who are in need.
So it sounds like there are there are a lot of different benefits to this. So how do we extend fasting beyond just Lent? How do we make this sort of a year-round practice?
Yeah. Well, there really are so many benefits, we could say, in our spiritual health to fasting. One of them is that when we fast, we delay the kind of instant gratification that we're used to getting and that our culture sort of promotes sometimes, right? We're used to living in a world where even when we talk about food, for many of us, not all of us, tragically, but food is readily available. So even just delaying our sense of gratification from food, we might also think about how we consume media. Delaying that gratification gives us a greater sense of patience, perhaps a greater openness and attention to other things that are going on around us. And actually, there are benefits, right, to continuing that practice throughout the year. Hopefully this season of Lent, for instance, let's say I give up scrolling Instagram over, my 40 days of Lent. Well, hopefully that will extend then into some practices that give us a greater sense of moderation throughout the rest of the year. There are a lot of people right now who are abstaining from, for instance, like alcohol during January. People talk about dry January. Or I think about, I have a friend who was telling me about how he's now using an app that limits how much social media he consumes during an average day or an average week. All of these are practices that can be healthy for us because they delay that sense of instant gratification that sometimes can just mean that we're so filled with an overconsumption of whether it's media, whether it's food, whether it's anything that disconnects us from the sense of like openness to the spontaneous, openness to where God may be acting in our lives, openness to the fact that we need God and we need to leave space.
So you mentioned a lot of really good things. So I actually have a lot of questions that bounce off of what your last answer there. My first question is a lot of these habits seem like really, really hard to break. It's hard to get off of Instagram for 40 days maybe. So what are some strategies to be able to break those habits in Lent so that you can continue that throughout the rest of the year?
So from a sort of medical, psychological standpoint, there are good reasons that it is hard to break a habit. One is a very basic principle of how our minds work. Our brains can only attend to so many things at the same time. So when, for instance, we have a habit, let's say it's like our morning routine. We get up, we brush our teeth, we take a shower, we comb our hair, we put on an outfit, we prepare some breakfast. Some of these things we may do without using a lot of what we would call conscious thought because over time, as a habit forms in a really healthy way, our brains no longer need to use conscious thought in order to, for instance, go through our morning routine. This is very helpful to us because then it allows our brains to attend to other things. Maybe we're watching the news while we eat some cereal, or maybe we're reflecting on something that we have to do in our workday as we're going through our routine. So in a really healthy way, our brains develop this ability to attend to some things consciously, but other habits that we don't need to think about in the same way. If something, though, let's say a habit is something like that gives us pleasure. So for instance, maybe I have I really enjoy a certain food or beverage, right? Over time, if our brains develop pleasure, then the brain starts to release a neurotransmitter, a chemical called dopamine, which actually gives us a craving for that thing. And then it makes it harder to break the habit. So one strategy we can use is just trying to abstain or maybe hold off from, let's say, some habit or something that I really enjoy, even if I can delay or, let's say, not, perform that habit even for a day. At the beginning, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to have that willpower. But over time, psychologists tell us that if we can, for instance, let's say I really enjoy a certain food and I'm really used to every day, like let's say it's chocolate. I really like chocolate, right? But over time, if we give more space, just a little bit of delayed gratification, over time it does get easier to have less of that thing. It's important to say from a medical standpoint that abstaining from something or breaking a habit, though, is different than an addiction. There are some things for which we develop addictions, and that is a medical phenomenon for which simple willpower is often not enough. And so I want to make that distinction because breaking habits over time with some moderation, we can do it if it's something more simple. But then there are more complex realities like addiction, and that often requires a medical professional.
So how do you then, so now let's say you've gotten rid of whatever habit it was that may have been unhealthy, may have been distancing you from God, whatever it may be. How do you then replace that with a more healthy habit, a more God-centered habit, maybe?
Yeah, totally. Well, so one of the things, you're sort of already speaking to it, but one thing that people do sometimes feel helpful is when they are, craving a certain thing, that there is something else that might replace it. And it may be something, that's also pleasurable. So, one of the things that I really enjoy doing during the season of Lent is finding some really good spiritual reading that I've heard. Sometimes I rely on friends who say, oh, I read this book, or I found this writing really meaningful. So let's say, for instance, it's at the end of the day, and it's the time when we're really craving that thing that we gave up for Lent. I'll just give an example. But having some reading that's really nourishing is at least something that gives us some energy to focus that attention. So I would say you're speaking to it, but having something that replaces that thing that we might be craving. Not one-to-one. It may not take away that desire completely, but at least can refocus our attention on something that is life-giving for us, that is nourishing for us, even if it's in a different sense. I think that's a really healthy next step. That, paired with the fact that in time, it does get easier to break a habit simply because, like a good muscle, we're training our bodies to need it less. That's a really healthy thing.
Yeah, and so I guess when you sort of work out that faith muscle, it becomes more of that sort of unconscious thought that you were kind of mentioning earlier a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah.
It sounds almost like St. Paul in the prayer without ceasing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, if we speak spiritually, our prayer life and connection with God, it is helpful to think of it like a muscle, right? The more time and attention that we give to our spiritual lives, the more that we will be strengthened to continue it. This is one of the reasons I think for many people, Lent is a really nourishing time. And as difficult as it can be to give things up, I've even heard from some folks this weekend at the parish as we prepare for Lent. Some folks are really looking forward to it. I think because we know almost like a really, a healthy reset for our bodies, maybe like a medical checkup that we might do annually. We do Lent annually because we know we need it for our health, like we need to, attend to our muscles or any part of our body.
It's like a spiritual doctor's appointment, almost a spiritual checkup.
I think it's like a great way to think about it. It's a great way to think about it. It's like a spiritual checkup that we need at least annually. But like you're saying, hopefully some of the things that we do in Lent can continue throughout the year.
Yeah, and so you had mentioned how sort of difficult a lot of this, this process seems like difficult to, break the habits, replace them with new, better ones, all these other sorts of things. There is, of course, the Catholic idea of giving up suffering for the faith. How does that play in here?
Yeah, so sometimes during Lent especially, we will hear about the phenomenon of what some people call offering it up. And what does that mean? Lots of people have written about this. Pope Benedict actually writes about it. We're in the year of hope. Pope Benedict, during his papacy, wrote an encyclical letter called Spe Salvi, Saved in Hope. And he actually addressed this exact topic. And one of the things that he said is that, that idea of offer it up. I'm giving up, I'm back on my chocolate thing. I'm giving up chocolate for Lent. It's like a small thing, it's a small sacrifice, but it might kind of nag at me over Lent. Offering it up, Pope Benedict says, sometimes that can be like a throwaway line for people. Oh, I just offer it up. But actually, he says, there is a way in which, in the mystery of Christ, the mystery of God present in our world, there is a way that we do desire to make meaning, for good reason, out of the difficulties of our lives. And even something small, even a small annoyance, there is a way in which, in the mystery of God, we may make meaning out of that small suffering by understanding it as in the mystery of God united to the suffering of Christ. And Pope Benedict says, in the world, there is, we might say, he calls it a treasury, almost like a store of goodness, of compassion, and of love. And in the mystery of God, there's a way that we can understand those sacrifices as contributing to that great treasury of love and goodness in our world. I think that's a really beautiful thing to think about because we know we live in a world that needs more goodness. One of the ways I think about it is My sacrifice during Lent helps me to be in deeper relationship with God. Hopefully that makes me a person that shares more goodness, shares more love. So in that way, my little, end of the day craving for chocolate that I delay and wait until Easter, is there a way that I am becoming a more loving person, a more compassionate person for all the reasons we're talking about? Hopefully that contributes to this treasury of goodness that the world needs. I think that's a really powerful way to think about offering it up.
So it's not just about suffering, it's also about healing as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, because, in this, medically speaking, this is very true in our physical suffering, but it's true in our, in our spiritual brokenness as well. We do seek to make meaning out of the experiences of our lives. I found that to be very true in healthcare, and I think it's very true in spiritual care.
So actually that last answer that you gave segues very well into my next question, which is, you're going into your first Lent season as a priest. Do you anticipate a lot of parallels between your job as a priest during Lent and that as, a doctor?
I appreciate the question. It's something I think about a lot, and one of the things that I've already felt since starting ministry and then certainly after ordination is that, so much of what we do here, so much of the life of priesthood is about what I would call, and Pope Francis is using this word a lot during his papacy, accompaniment. Going with people and helping people know there's someone that is here to journey with you, no matter where you are on this faith journey. And I think about that as a really important part of what ministry, certainly priesthood, but we collaborate here with lots of people who are doing lay ministry, ordained ministry. It's really about accompaniment. It's really about making sure people know that they're not alone, which is always how we're called, as Christians to do this journey of faith together. So I think of walking with people, especially during the difficult moments. Lent spiritually is absolutely a time where we're called to be in touch with, we think about that notion of penance, called to be in touch with our shortcomings, called to be in touch with what we might call our brokenness. And good, a good spiritual caregiver, whether it's a priest or any minister in our community, is someone who's going to go with people while we are working through that brokenness that we all carry. That's a spiritual reality. As a physician, one of the things that was always very, very powerful, but a part of the work for sure, was journeying with people who were experiencing the brokenness of our physical selves or our emotional selves. It's a very big part of being a physician, of being a healthcare provider. So I think that there is this reality of accompaniment. What we're doing here is accompanying one another in our spiritual journey, something that we take very seriously during Lent. I think of it a lot like going with people on, thinking about our mental, our physical well-being. Sometimes we can provide a lot. We can provide a lot of healing, a lot of treatment, but a lot of the work is going with people. I am someone who will go with you. I will not leave you alone. That is a really important part of being a doctor, and I think it's also a really important part of being a priest as well. The other thing that I think is an important parallel between work as a physician, physical, emotional caregiving, and spiritual caregiving as a priest is that, all of us are looking to make meaning in our lives. And I always felt that most of my work was with people who had, pretty serious illness. And there is a lot of meaning making that goes on, especially when people are confronted with their own mortality. That might be reconciling, what are the most important contributions I've made in my life? How do I understand the things that have been difficult about my life? How do I understand relationships that have been life-giving or that have been very challenging? Facing our mortality absolutely causes many people to try to make some meaning out of the journey of their life. As a priest, in Lent, it's very clear that that is also an important part of what we do during this time. How do I make meaning of the experiences of my life? If I'm in touch with my shortcomings, how do I understand God in that? Where is God in that? What is God calling me to do? I think that there's a lot of meaning making that goes on, especially during Lent. And as a priest, that makes me think about some of the work that I did as a physician when people are facing what we might call the desert or the difficult moments of confronting mortality.
That's almost sort of that Ash Wednesday theme of like, to dust you shall return, right?
100%.
Yeah.
That's I love that, Jack. That's a great way to think about it. How do I understand God? How do I understand life's meaning and purpose, my life's meaning and purpose, when I'm confronted with the fact that to dust I will return. To dust I will return as a spiritual being, a physical being. That is absolutely the work that we're called to do, the journey that we're on together.
Excellent. Do you have anything else to add? I think that's all the questions that I have.
No, that's great. I mean, I'm so grateful. I'm looking forward to beginning this Lenten journey here at the parish, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where we go.
I am too. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jack.
Okay. Thank you, Father.